Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. It's a wonderful day on the East Coast. It's a pretty great day, but you didn't hear join me to go on a monologue about my day. Join me because I'm joined by a special guest, a genuine roadie of sorts, Mr. Roy Duncan, to cover the subject of the fascinating story of Rhodesia. Mr. Roy, without any further ado, how are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm really good, man. It's great. I'm down here in the Western Cape province of South Africa. Um, we're having a little cold snap. It's our spring, and we've got in the Klein Karoo, as it's known, where I currently live. It's a blessing when we get a bit of rain and it cools down and the rain falls. So it's a good day, and I'm feeling great, and I'm really happy to finally be with you live here, man. We missed each other a few times. All my fault, so apologies for that. But I'm really happy to be with you and ready to jump into it.
No, it's understandable. I mean, it's South Africa, whereas plenty of people have pointed out where people steal cable every single day, and where there's a race riot. It seems like every day, pretty much, depending on where you are in the country. So, also the most violent country on earth, in some respects. So it's understandable. But let's get into the subject of today's stream. Um, so you are a genuine roadie of sorts, correct, Mr. Roy? Mr.
Look, man, I was born in 1966. Um, in 1965 was when the unilateral Declaration of Independence was made by Ian Smith and his Rhodesian Front government after the British essentially betrayed and denied their people, who in part are my people. And so I grew up, you know, right through the entire uh, part of, let us say, independent Rhodesia, all the way through to today, well, until 1980 and the independence of the new Zimbabwe. So, yeah, I'm pretty much both a Rhodesian, a Zimbabwean, and a South African. And yeah, most of the people that come from Rhodesian, Zimbabwean stock have had to make huge adjustments, particularly, well, not just only the white population, but we certainly were broken apart by, various mishaps and terrible politics and awful Afro-nationalist rule by Robert Mugabe, which broke our families and our heritage into pieces. But yep, I'm proud to say, even my South African ID says I was born in Rhodesia.
Well, that's pretty epic. It says that. That's a pretty proud accomplishment. Not many people can claim to have that these days, you know. But obviously, Rhodesia's been kind of like recircled into our spotlights. People have been reinterested in the subject, I would say, in our sphere, and I kind of wanted to like go into that. Like, so what was it genuinely like there in the country? What was the mood, the atmosphere of everyday life like in Rhodesia? And if you could speak about like which province you were from, or city, and go into that, that would be great as well. What it was like in everyday life.
Sure. Look, I think it's best to start, kind of at the beginning of my story, and that is that my great grandfather was a guy called Alexander Heathcote Tullach, and he was of Scottish descent. And he trekked up in 1880s, 1888, 1890 into what became southern Rhodesia, and then eventually Rhodesia, and then Zimbabwe. And I was born in 1966, so 1890, 76 years before I was born. My great grandfather was one of the original pioneers on what they call the pioneer column, which essentially was just like the Wild West with wagons and oxen and mules and donkeys, and it was really old school, Wild West type of vibe. And those guys came in, and I've got all the historical evidence of that in books and photographs and family memorabilia, icons of all sorts that prove it. And it's part of my blood and my heritage. So I know it like the back of my hand. It happened, and 76 years later, I was born. But in that 76 years, um, our forefathers and the people before us built an entire country, roads, telegraph, railways, cities, towns, schools, farms, mines, exports, imports, fuel, vehicles, you name it. It was an incredible rise in development. Probably one of the most incredible stories of transformation that you can imagine. So, by the time I was aware of myself and moving around and looking at my environment, Rhodesia was, well established. And well, I must say, it was an incredible place. It was a wonderful place. It had the most laid back, gentle, um, easygoing, non-racial, non-subjective, non-oppressive, developmental attitude that I've ever seen, and I've never seen it again, and I doubt I ever will. And yeah, it was a great place to be a kid. It was an enormous, looking back on it, an enormous pleasure to have had the privilege of growing up in that place. You know, 50 years. Well, I'm 58 years old. I'm nearly 60. So, in my lifetime, cities were built, intercity highways were built, railways were built, manufacturing. It was unbelievable, the absolute focus on development, skills development. When my ancestors rode into Rhodesia with the permission and contract between Cecil John Rhodes and Lobengula, the king of the Matabele at the time. When we went into Mashonaland, it was literally a tribal, sparsely populated, a tribal zone, uh, with persecution of the Mashona people, who Mugabe is of that tribe, or that tribal grouping. And yeah, from absolute nothing rose this country of greatness. Um, the farming there was just out of this world. My great grandfather, my great great grandfather, my grandfather, my father, and I all became farmers. I remember the tobacco lands and the maize fields, the schools, the order, the safety. It was an unbelievable time to be alive, and I miss it. And I wish that it was never broken apart, and it should not have been. A lot of the context of history has been lost over the years because people fail to, well, the Afro-nationalist, socialist left essentially eradicates history, and even the good. And in history, you can never have just positives. They're negatives, But Rhodesia was a positive, and it was a positive to the point that when Mugabe took power in 1980, Julius Nyerere, the president of Tanzania at that time, actually said to him, "You've inherited a jewel. Uh, just don't fuck it up." And fuck it up he did. But yeah, it was a wonderful place. We didn't have the same sort of apartheid type rules that South Africa had. It wasn't as rigid and mean as that. You got to remember that the tribes people of the time, both the Mandebele and the Shona speakers, the Ndao speakers in the east, and the Tongas in the west, were living a completely primitive life. And in came this wagon train of just a few hundred souls, and they transformed the country into what was eventually the breadbasket of Africa, and fought, if you like, against the might of the East and the communist bloc being Russia and China at the time. So you got to imagine, you know, we white Rhodesians were only 500,000 people. Um, at our zenith, perhaps just under maybe 460,000 people. And from that core of folk, we waged war against what was the great domination and the scramble for Africa between the East and the West at the time. So yeah, man, it was something else. It was truly incredible.
I can imagine. I want to go back to that statement you just said, breadbasket of Africa, which is like, I mean, Zimbabwe is sort of synonymous with failed states. I mean, it's up there with like Somalia, with just like, I mean, just mass starvation, runaway inflation, corruption to like the 10th degree, even for African standards, which is quite something. But when you look at the land and the geography, it's not for natural reasons with like other countries who are just like desert, where that would make sense. It's like, no, the land is extremely fertile. It is purely just like management and like how they do these things to where it's like the people are starving, like literally, compared to the other system, which was extremely successful. In my Tayada, within those, like, you know, like you said, it was 20 to 30 years when the pioneer column first entered southern Rhodesia, maybe at the time. I mean, they had rail infrastructure. I think the most extensive, maybe behind South Africa on the continent at the time, right, just right behind it. Highways, transportation, like all these things of like a modern European country, essentially, within like just the span of like maybe 10 years or something like that. And like things ran pretty well. It wasn't this like highly, as you said before, Rhodesia was not an apartheid state. It didn't have racially segregated laws, at least to the same way that South Africa did under the Afrikaner government at the time. It was more separate but equal type of laws. As far as I understood, as long as a black man became English and educated, he could run for political office. As far as I understood it, that's how Rhodes and later Ian Smith interpreted that idea, because Ian Smith was a gradualist. He wanted to gradually turn to majority rule. Whether that would have
Yeah,
happened or not is up to debate. And obviously, when you look at the results, wasn't a great thing, quite frankly. You know, that quote that you just brought up by the Tanzanian president is very fitting. It was the jewel for quite a long time. I mean, Southern Rhodesia was one of the most successful countries in Africa, just right behind South Africa, quite frankly, in terms of its achievements. And let's keep in mind here, like, basically overnight, Rhodesia was declared like an enemy of the world by like Britain, the British Empire, and America. Because, like, again, this like idea of decolonization and mass democracy must be implemented no matter what, basically. And if that means that, like, you know, white settlers, you know, people who founded and like built this country from nothing, like, get hurt or genocided or the land confiscated, like, whatever, we have to appease these liberal ideas, then like we're going to enforce this no matter what. And like you see this in the way they acted. I mean, you know, the British at the time under Macmillan and other British prime ministers, and including General Ford, I think the U.S. president at the time, General Ford.
Yeah.
Like again, it was a policy of just like, which didn't even really make sense because Rhodesia was an insanely pro-Western state at its core, and like insanely pro-British. I mean, it took the British basically isolating them and like sending the Royal Navy to like the Portuguese colony of Mozambique to blockade Rhodesia's only like port access at Beira. I think that's how you say the name of the port, to stop their oil
Yeah.
access to the country, to
Yeah.
basically like start collapsing them and to like force them to
Yeah.
come to the table, right, under Britain's terms, right. I mean, these
Yeah.
people were the most Anglophile people you could think of. I mean, like, Ian Smith said it correctly. We're more British than the British are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, we're fighting against the old world, right? I mean, Rhodesia was kind of like spiritually like, hey, let's take an alternative path to mass decolonization, right? Maybe we shouldn't like repeat the same mistakes that happened in the Belgian Congo, other places, right? Where like,
Yeah.
things didn't go very well for the white minority, and all these other things. So that's not very great for the West in the geopolitical terms. That you're just going to open these countries up to the Eastern Bloc. But again, ideological capture took hold over what made sense, and good at the time.
Yeah, look, well said. I mean, you're pretty spot on there. Yeah, I concur. You definitely know your history. Um, Ian Smith was I don't know what the word you use, but he was a
A
progressionist or
gradualist, yeah,
a
gradualist.
gradualist. It's a fantastic phrase. I've never used it before, but I've thought about the process many times. Yeah, I mean, let me try and kind of give you some context in that sort of gradualist reality. When my great grandfather Sandy Tullach, the guy I mentioned in the beginning of the chat, when he passed the Northern Kruger in South Africa, before they went into the Matabele controlled zone, in order to pass through into Mashonaland and then begin the colony, if you like, or the settlement of the interior, or the central and north and east of what is today Zimbabwe. There were 10 Shangaan guys, South African in today's borders, 10 Shangaan warriors, young men that attached themselves to him, because he provided meat, and being with the column was way cooler than just hanging out in the village. And those 10 men stayed with him right through until 1893, when my great grandfather was was born. And and today still their people and their genetics are spread all over the eastern border, where my ancestors settled. But you've got to imagine, at the time, the Matabele, descendants of Shaka Zulu, of the Zulu of KwaZulu Natal today in South Africa, also, part of the great migration south out of West Central Africa, of the what they so-called Bantu migration. They left Shaka Zulu behind because of his uh, cruelty and craziness, and eventually ended up settling in what is today southern Zimbabwe, and in what is today Bulawayo. Bulawayo was the kraal, or the homestead, or the central seat of power for the Matabele people. But at the time, the Matabele had absolutely no regard whatsoever for any other tribe whatsoever. And the statistics of the day, um, which is part of the heritage and history that I'm actually looking at a whole lot of my old Rhodesiana collection here. There were only 60, 70,000 Shona people in Rhodesia at the time, because the Matabele, for around 30 years, had been carrying out a consistent genocide against them. And in fact, they even had a phrase called the beautiful death or the beautiful killing, where they would stab their assegais into the Shona, and the Shona dog, as they called them. And so when those white folk came, my ancestors included, um, the Matabele, the Zulu heritage people, refused point blank to work for the whites as they developed the telegraph and the roads and the railways and built farms. And as a result, the Shona people, who were previously persecuted almost to the point of extinction, were given, just by circumstance, an absolutely protective layer of defense against the Matabele. And in fact, that is why, and I have the books right here, the Matabele uprisings of the 1890s. And those uprisings were essentially against the settlers, because they were protecting the minority Shona speaking tribes against the marauding that they were used to, and the slaughter of them that they were used to. So you've got to take that context and imagine uh, a group of people living in clans under chiefs and sub chiefs, persecuted, pursued, constantly harassed by waves of very powerful, very well organized Matabele impis, living in huts and having temporary hideouts on top of mountains where they would store water in clay pots and rocks to throw down on the Matabele as they came in. And they would sometimes be besieged for days and weeks on top of mountains as the Matabele attempted to flush them out and murder them. And so you take that and then say to yourself that 50 years later, there was civilization, there was housing, there was clothing, there was textiles, there was education, there were universities, there was transport, railways, logistics, communication. And you said that back 50 years, and it was just a crazy genocide with the Matabele dominating everybody else, east to west. So, take that context and then just see how incredible it was, a transformation.
No, this is the case whenever you look at most like white settlers or colonies. When you look at the British or the Dutch or the Belgians or the Germans, like or the French, whenever they come into a country, it's not this like leftist Afro-nationalist picture. It's a paradise and everybody's getting along. Far from it. Actually, most of the time when you look at it, there's ethnic conflict where one group is killing a minority group every single time, and the Europeans usually try to stop that kind of infighting or genocide, as you like to use it. It's not this perfect harmonious society where everybody gets along. Far from it. As you mentioned, they would. You said like the Shana would retreat to mountaintops and hills, like to escape the Matabele warriors, right? To escape their kind of ethnic cleansing from the country, and it was only like the arrival of the pioneer column under Cecil Rhodes, right, which kind of stopped like their permanent erasure from the country. And like
That's
this
a
isn't
fact.
like an isolated case to Rhodesia either. This is the case like throughout a lot of Africa. Like much to contrary to the narrative you're taught that the blacks lived in harmony and peace, and it was only the white man who caused all these problems. Far from that. As you brought up, that's a great point as well.
Yeah, look, you're absolutely right, and there's definitely no way out of that. You can be as radical Afro socialist as you like and try to cancel that, but that's a fact. And I mean, I've got history books here from the 1800s that document tribes such as the Ovimbundu, also part of the southern migration of the Bantu who settled on the central plateau of Angola. And those guys became so powerful that they controlled from southern Tanzania to the Limpopo River. And they were slave traders par excellence. In fact, their very last client was the Catholic Church in Brazil, where they were shipping captured Africans from the basin, well, from the area that is southern Tanzania to the south part of modern day Zimbabwe. So there was no such thing as Wakanda. There was no such thing as happy life and just it's all going perfect. And then, Jan van Riebeck set his booted toe on the sands of the beaches in Cape Town, or Cecil John Rhodes and my great great grandfather crossed the Limpopo into Matabeleland and destroyed their lives. Far from it. In fact, that is the most irritating and stupid argument that I've ever heard, and it's part and parcel of the reason that I'm so vociferous on X about it, because you just this revisionist history takes away from the value of everybody, not just the white settlers who brought the fundamental knowledge of how to do these things, how to engineer stuff. People say, well, particularly on X, but, the common populist narrative is to say, well, look, you built all that, but on the back of whips and slavery. But there's just no way that you can build a country on the back of whipping and slavery. You have to have people to become educated to the way of work, to understand repetitive motion, to understand process, and to begin to grasp a sense of responsibility. And the Rhodesians did that very, very well. And remember that, my family and many families that came out of there were not just British who arrived on a ship in Cape Town and then went straight to Rhodesia. My blood is so mixed. I don't know who I am in real terms. I actually am looking forward to doing a DNA test and finding out. But I know for sure that there's Boer blood in me, there's Afrikaner blood in me, there's English and Dutch and even I believe Swedish. So it took a hell of a lot of coercion, manipulation, and undocumented reality. Suddenly there were cities, suddenly there were railways. There's no such thing, and you can't do that if you're abusing people, because they'll run away or they'll fight you and they'll kill you. And Rhodesia just wasn't an oppressive society. It just simply wasn't. I lived through the entire Civil War, and then I lived through the entirety of Robert Mugabe's despotic dictatorship. And I must tell you, if I could do it all again, you put me, and I bet you, well, I don't know how many black folk even remember what it was like, but those that did remember, and I see it quite often on the internet where people say, you know what, regardless of the fact of this modern revisionist history, times in Rhodesia were better than they were in Zimbabwe, and they most certainly were better than they are today.
I mean, that's just measurably true when you look at every single metric. I mean, the most famous example of this is like the bazillion-dollar Zimbabwe note, which has to be printed because the currency is so worthless that you have to like, start using billions.
I've got one. Yeah.
I mean, like again, this was never a problem in Rhodesia or South Africa. Like I don't remember that ever being a problem. You don't hear stories of the great inflation of the currency where they have to make $1,000,000 banknotes because the currency is so worthless. They start doing things in millions just to equal a few pennies, right? And like American dollars or something like that. And like let's like sort of get into that like thing. So you said like you lived through the entirety of Rhodesia's life and then the transition to Mugabe. Can you sort of describe what the vibe was like towards the end of the Civil War? as we were getting towards this like inevitable, basically like truth and reconciliation, like imposed idea of black majority rule over you. Like, what was the feeling like? Um, can you describe what that process was like as like Ian Smith signed the declarations of surrender, basically, to the country?
Yo, that's a hell of a memory to bring back. I was 15 years old, I think, 15 or 16 years old at the time. Um, when let me answer it by going back to history. So, in the early 1900s, my family was part and parcel of building a city called Umtali, now renamed Mutare. But it is a city on the eastern border, which is today the eastern border of Zimbabwe and Mozambique. And we developed, when I say we, the family developed, the city, the schools, the farms, and gold mines. In fact, my family were the first people to farm gold, to mine gold, the first people to farm fruit commercially there. And they were, a real sort of a pioneer family, and as a result, they had a hand in everything that was developed. And the school that they built was called Amtali Boys and Amtali Girls. They were high schools, beautiful, extremely well laid out, 100% excellent level of education. And I remember in 1978 going to play rugby against Amtali Boys, and I was at a school in Salisbury, or today Harare, and we took a train the 400 or 500 kilometers overnight, and got into Umtali, and we played rugby against those schools there. And in those days, we were living in under a real true war, daily death tolls, landmines, massacres, terrorism, army, helicopters, gunships, all of our parents, uncles, brothers in the army, in the war, getting killed, getting wounded, you name it. As kids, I mean, I got an Uzi when I was 11 years old. I could shoot an Uzi. I could shoot an FN 7.62 when I was 12, and yeah, it was it was crazy, awesome, weird war, civil war, and the war kind of lasted literally until the last day before independence. We had a little sort of government of national unity. There was a strange country called Zimbabwe, Rhodesia. The tensions were high during that time, but all of a sudden, it was almost going from classical music, a Beethoven concerto, into a reggae concert. It was akin to today, walking out of your apartment and they've painted an LGBTQ, a zebra crossing across the road, and you're forced to go to a gay pride parade. It was juxtaposed. It was one and the other. It was black and white. It was completely and utterly chalk and cheese. And it was pretty cool. It was pretty cool, I must say. In fairness, the early days in Zimbabwe, the first 10 years, it was paradise. The war had ended. Mugabe was speaking, parroting sanity, reconciliation, the Rainbow Nation, just as Mandela did here. And we all thought that it would last forever because, indeed, um, straight after independence, it was pretty damn cool. Everybody just maintained their position, and of course, then people started to grow. The economy grew, international tourists arrived, things construction boom happened, housing happened, the economy really exploded. Blacks came into uh, higher end schooling systems. Of course, blacks were always welcome in the universities, and many black people were extremely well educated throughout the Rhodesian time. I mean, Mugabe had 9 degrees that he gained partly in prison, and so you know. But yeah, early Zimbabwe was really great, man. And we loved it. And in fact, I was a patriot, and I was extremely overwhelmed. I suppose my age, as I became a man, so Zimbabwe happened. And yeah, it was a time of great hope and a great freedom, and really safe. It was super safe. I mean, there was some banditry left over. I think I did a podcast with one or two folks. I can't remember who it was, but talking about my operations in Mozambique against some bandits there and what have you. But yeah, it was mostly a time of great hope and a time of joy and a time of freedom. You know.
Okay, that's interesting. I never heard that perspective towards the end. My picture in this mind, it's always kind of like this Nelson Mandela moment in 1994, where like the good moderate, right, the good black moderate, as like liberals tell you, like we'll just put the black moderate in charge and have majority rule, and everything's gonna go well for you. Nothing bad's gonna happen. And like we had this faux, like faux nice. We're gonna be nice to you for the first couple years, like you say, and then immediately the true radical positions that they've always had throughout the war, the Civil War, whatever birth these groups, right, comes out, right? You start getting the land seizures, well, you're racist and you're white, so you deserve to be murdered by this group of criminals or something like that. Everything starts to decay, right? State services start collapsing, potholes don't get fixed, power, load shedding, right? There's no power, rail services don't work, all these types of things. So when did that transition happen for you? You said the first 10 years were relatively cozy, as we like to say in the younger generation, but things transitions quite quickly after that.
Yeah. So look, I mean, there was a chance. Zimbabwe had a real chance of forging a new path, a path of not modern day multiculturalism as it is shoved down our necks by the liberal left all day, but a genuine, hardworking, pragmatic uh, potential. It could have become um, the leading country on the African continent without a doubt post independence. And Mugabe, just like Julius Nyerere said, inherited a jewel. But a communist is a communist is a communist. And they are vengeful, self righteous, and non negotiable. And most of us with a Western mindset, or at least a democratic mindset, are interested in dialogue and working out solutions, because otherwise it's bloodshed, right? And we just had 15 years of utter hell and bloodshed. So there was absolutely no reason and no desire, no hunger between the white, the Indian, the colored, the black population of Rhodesia to get involved in more animosity and the breaking down and crumbling of society. Everybody, in fact, uh, put their shoulder behind the new independent state, and the innovations were unbelievable. But soon enough, the cracks started to appear. And that is the next phase. And that's where the Zimbabwefication, or the breakdown of law, of order, the trust of society for the government happened. And Mugabe took full advantage of the low hanging fruit of Afro nationalism, and as a result, I believe, transformed not just Zimbabwe into a basket case from a breadbasket, but also influenced the continued and the destruction of what is today South Africa and Mozambique and many neighboring countries. Zimbabwe is a strange place. It is very strangely influential. In fact, I'll let you know that I spent a lot of time with the current president of Zimbabwe, Emerson Mnangagwa, and I got to know him and his family extremely well. And for a long while, I was mentor and how do you look at how would I say it? I was the personal um, attaché to his firstborn son, and we've seen it. We've seen it from end to end how you can take something fantastic and just destroy it. And the Mnangagwas are extremely powerful, the current family that rule that place. And the reason being is that Emerson Mnangagwa, before Mugabe and before any other black nationalist on the continent, was the very first, and he was a teenager at the time, was the very first black person to ever go and be trained by communist China in the art of terrorism, or at least, revolutionary aggression. And so that heritage, you must imagine, is a badge of honor for him. And so it is for every other African that calls themselves comrade, because that is the legacy of that time. In a way, I believe that it's coming to an end. Regionally, Zimbabwe is not as powerful as it used to be. They are a laughing stock. It is a failure. And you look around you at Kenya, at Rwanda, at Zambia, at Botswana, at Namibia, even Angola. They're trying to dig their way out from under the rock of communism and the multiple decades of destruction that caused.
Okay, that's an interesting perspective. Yeah, I would say that analysis is pretty correct. I mean, there was this great term during the Bush War where they would call their opponents gooks, right? Instead of
Yeah,
Africans. And the reason for that was because a lot of these the ZANU and ZAPU terrorists, as I'm going to call them, had training from Red China and the Soviet Union at the time, who gave them like weapons training, military equipment, financial support, and of course revolutionary ideas through books and other media that were shipped into the country in order to undermine the Ian Smith government and cause continual collapse and decay and continue to fund the violence, right, that will inevitably lead to the collapse of a successful state, to spread the revolution.
yeah, yeah.
And you
That's what
see,
happened.
yeah, and you see the legacy of that, right, where Zimbabwe is just a laughingstock. It's a joke. It's kind of up there with Somalia in terms of just like failed states where you have mass starvation in the 21st century, like inflation that gives Venezuela a run for its money, right? And I watched a recent video where like the money situation is actually so bad. They don't give you change anymore in Zimbabwe. They give you candy to cover the cents because American dollars and cents are actually worth so much more than the Zimbabwe, whatever they call it now. I don't even know. They change it every 5 seconds. Type of thing, and it's like, well, that's quite something, right? Where you stick out, even in terms of African countries, right? Where things are not necessarily great or going well, but at least they're trying to do something. And you have Zimbabwe over here, which is going to stick its heels in the sand, right? And continue on this revolution, right? Even
Yeah,
if we're going to lose the revolutionary rhetoric anymore, right? Because like the Cold War paradigm is gone now. So
yeah,
now it's in terms of, I would say, the liberal paradigm, liberal socialist paradigm now is what they're trying to emulate, right? From the collapse of
yeah,
that old paradigm.
yeah. Look, I mean, I'll tell you a couple of things that spring to mind listening to your excellent analysis, and that is that it's it's hugely unfortunate that it's also irredeemable. Um, you can't save it. It will never be the same again. The quintessential factors that formed what was Rhodesia, what was early Zimbabwe, are are gone. And when I say they're gone, again, people don't really think in context. And I mean, really, who thinks about Zimbabwe? You ask people in New York City where Zimbabwe is on a map, they would definitely 99 would not get it right out of 100. But the reality is that it's irredeemable. And why I say so is that you may bring back a government in that country that begins to make the right movements in terms of society in general, in terms of the economy, in terms of some sort of democratic fairness. But that's that's nothing in comparison to getting back what was lost. And what was lost is that the rivers now run dry because of the land use policies that were implemented post independence. There's a great river in Zimbabwe called the Save, 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 as you would say it. And it flowed for hundreds of kilometers, a broad, big Central African river. It flowed off of what we call the Mashonaland Escarpment south, and then eventually into the lowest point of Zimbabwe, 316 meters above sea level to be exact, at the northern point of the Gonarenzo National Park. And that river used to be navigated hundreds of years ago when the ancient city, which is now called Great Zimbabwe, the slave and gold and diamond and mineral trading center, that river used to be navigated all the way from the Indian Ocean to Zimbabwe uh, by Arab and Chinese ships. Today, it barely flows. It is silted. Deforestation is such that you will never ever recover huge, gigantic swathes of indigenous forests and everything that was linked to that ecosystem. The animals are destroyed. The wildlife areas are destroyed. What is left is significant, but it's only the protected areas, and even those are under threat. I mean, just this week, Zimbabwe killed 200 elephants to feed starving Zimbabweans. So it's irredeemable. The mistakes of these oppressive, dictatorial socialists is so high. The cost of these governments is extremely high, and then not to mention the generational destruction of young minds. Remember, Zimbabwe is 44 years old, nearly half a century since 1980, and and at least 25 to 30 years of that is just only a history of debauchery, of destruction, of racism, of one party dictatorial oppression, of genocide. And how do you recover from that? It would take a spiritual and even, I don't know, it would take an event to change those people and to bring them back to a stubborn, true reality, and get them going again. So the cost of Mugabe and the terror that he has brought upon the region and on that country is immeasurable. It could have been something completely different, not Rhodesia. Everyone was completely, absolutely happy to find out what the next chapter would be. But instead of building it into the paradise that it had every potential to be, it was ripped to shreds by greed and hate and a lust for power.
That's very well said, Mr. Lloyd. I think that you find that every time these, communist, like liberal progressive, race communists take power, you see the same thing in South Africa, right? Where as soon as they get into power in 1994, right, and get rid of the racist system and change the flag, and we're going to become this new rainbow nation, right? You see that things gradually begin to get worse and worse and worse over time. These things of the old civilization that we used to cherish, like the wildlife and the rivers and like good land management, infrastructure, these things that we take for granted in the West still, like they get eroded and taken away in the name of the revolution, essentially, one stage at a time. And like you can essentially never go back to the state that previously existed because it's been so thoroughly destroyed. There's nothing left. I mean, a lot of these places are just ruins now, and like you said, they're literally eating elephants because they're starving to death. So,
Yeah.
I mean, what does that alone tell you about, Zimbabwe itself? That we had to destroy Rhodesia so that it could become this state where you have to eat elephants to survive. And the same thing
Yeah.
in South Africa too, right? Where we have to destroy this, like, and again, I'm not saying there's problems with apartheid, but you can argue like under the South African state, under the Afrikaners, right? People weren't starving to death. There wasn't like this mass crime every single day, copper wire thieves, stealing wire, rolling blackouts, droughts. I think Cape Town in 2021 almost became the first major city on earth to run out of water because of poor water management.
Yeah.
I don't remember that happening in the Afrikaner state. These types of things were the government under Ian Smith, and it happens every single time these progressive race communists get into power. Like it happened in the Belgian Congo. I mean, you can name your African state or colony, right, where we have to destroy this evil system, right, to establish this global revolution, right, of global race communism, essentially, is what I like to call it. And it always turns out to be a complete disaster. 100% of the time, that turns into a trash heap, right? Like it
Yeah.
essentially eats and corrodes away whatever was good and built in the previous country, right? And makes it like a shithole, basically.
Yeah. Donald Trump said that. Look, I mean, I tell you what, it did not have to be that way. I mean, I remember as a child being taught by my grandparents to be respectful to everybody around us. My grandfather and grandmother on my father's side had a beautiful tobacco and maize farm uh, near what is called the Great Dyke in a place called Trelawney, Bank at Trelawney, where they built sports clubs and golf courses out of the bush there. And we had a guy that worked in the house called Midion, and he was the most he was the most lovely guy. Even this minute, it could bring a tear to my eye if I wasn't such a staunch old bastard. But Midian was just the most beautiful human being. He loved me, and I loved him. And I would spend as much time as possible with Midian and with Midian's kids, and in the workers' village on the farm. And those kids were my friends, and we educated each other in everything. And we spoke each other's languages. We 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 were an integrated people. What did you call Ian Smith? A
A
progressionist,
gradualist.
a
Gradualist.
gradualist. And there was this spirit of gradualism. And I'm telling you something. People might shoot me down because of this podcast. Well, they will, especially the arrogant, idiotic left. But I'll tell you something for nothing. Even the black Africans were gradualists and happy to be gradualists. Because even within the ecology of a farm, the economy of a farm, uh, people had opportunity to rise. Uh, you know, well, give you an example. I managed a farm. Uh, when I was a young man, I was given an opportunity to run a very big estate, parallel and with, of course, the owner. But he saw something in me and wanted me to take reins of a very, very, very big estate. And I'm talking about the one of the largest producers of fruit in our country. We had 550 permanent workers living in brick and mortar homes with hot and cold running water. We had a school, a junior school, a headmaster, and two teachers. We had a permanent clinic with a nursing sister on site and a doctor once a week. We had a farm sponsored football team. We grew 80 hectares of maize just to ensure that we supplemented the staple diet. There was a farm store that everybody had an account at and was able to buy their goods and uniforms and bicycles and radios. We had a herd of Jersey cattle that, free milk and whey and butter was given out. It was just an incredible place. Workshops and engineering and people learning how to manage life and grow up and become something. And the bright-eyed nature of the African was at its absolute peak, even through Rhodesia and into early Zimbabwe, where there was just hope written over the entire nation. And then this death, this black, awful death of this communist, horrible Mugabeism, Stalinism, Maoism, and then coupled with absolute greed and denial and a murderous retribution of spirit took over. We haven't yet spoken, and of course we're running out of time now. But the first thing Mugabe did after winning independence and becoming president was to revenge and commit a terrible genocide against the Mandebele, killing over 30,000 of those good people in a genocide inside after the independence of modern day Zimbabwe, called now known as Gukurahundi, one of the most terrible events in modern African times prior to the huge genocide in Rwanda. So, and even that was swept under the carpet because of the goodwill of the liberal West. Oh, let's not talk about that. Let's still give them another chance. And today in South Africa, you see 80, 90 murders a day, 200, 300 rapes a day, 150 hijackings. I mean, we got friends on X that'll get the statistics more correctly than I can. But it's been turned into an absolute mess. Whereas, had they allowed that progression to happen, that slow and gentle and caring progression to happen, where education, where a mentorship was accepted and transferred, so we would have potentially been a powerhouse in this part of the world. But instead, they chose the route of greed and communism and hell, and so today it is what it is.
No, that's very well said, man. I do want to get to some of the questions in the comment section we have for you.
Go on.
And then I think we'll kind of close out the stream from there, but I think that's very well said.
Sure. Thank you.
Mr. Popcorn Power says the breadbasket of Africa. Nobody would want to give that up, right? Well, you will. If you're a radical race communist, you will give that up.
Well, you must understand that they didn't give anything up. It kind of meant nothing to them in the first place. Any success apart from their own was viewed as an intimidation to them. It was an awkward reality. Facing excellence is something that these people don't do. So yeah, I mean, it wasn't even a choice for them. It was an absolute that they would destroy it. Who gives a fuck about starvation, right, or food? No, man, you're right. No one in their right mind would do it, but those bastards did it, and they did it
100,
with a cold fist.
100%. Requiet, I think that's how you say your name. Even pictures of the Congo look nice from a certain period, but the Rhodesian ones look amazing.
Oh yeah, look, Rhodesia was an amazing place. It was an absolutely amazing place for black, for white, for anyone who lived within its borders. It was an incredible place. The freedom, the happiness, the hope, the opportunity, the realities of life back then were such that they will never be duplicated. They will never return. It was almost as if, like grains of sand through the hourglass, or some sort of paradigm. Um, when it changed for good, and something of the old world and the old hope and the old joys uh, were gone forever.
Very sadly true, yes. Mr. Popcorn Power against this majority rule has worked out well for South Africa. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. Yes, so that's very true. I think half of the population under ANC rule is basically welfare dependent in the breadlines. So there you go, right there.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of debatable, but yep, the system is what it does,
Which
which
seems
seems
to be
to be the
destructive.
destruction of everything.
It is because
Look,
it's
I
under
mean,
these progressive race communists who seek to destroy everything that is, quote, racist, white, oppressive. And they're willing to destroy everything and burn civilization down to do it.
well, look, I'm an African, okay? I don't give a continental fuck what anybody says. I'm an African man. My son is an African. My daughter's African. My wife is African. We are Africans, and I'm proud to be who I am. I'm proud of my heritage. I'm proud of my continent, my country, and my country now of South Africa, and I'm proud to have been a Rhodesian. But let's be fair and let's look at the world without rose-colored glasses. Um, the same thing's happening in the West. I don't see this migration shit that's going on in Europe and in North America to be anything else but exactly the same thing, just translated differently, but it's the same folks doing it. So the destructive forces in South Africa today, we have unchecked migration. Our country is full, absolutely. I mean, I'm talking overloaded with Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, uh, Ethiopians, Congolese, Zimbabweans, Mozambicans, Malawians, Nigerians. It's overloaded, unchecked, unbridled, absolute free for all, just as it is in many of the states of America, and that's becoming more and more apparent, and we see it every day on the airwaves. So the same thing is happening in Great Britain. The same thing is happening in Western Europe. So you got to see it in context. What we lost when we lost Rhodesia was probably the final nail in the coffin for any future independence as the global machine marched forward and over us, crunching us in its path.
Yeah, you saw the death of the old world mindset, and you see
That's
the
right.
birth of
And,
this
and
new world, basically being forced by force.
truly, man.
This truly, Popcorn Power says, I recall watching an interview of Rhodesian leader complaining that the white people that they killed off and chased away did not teach them about money, as they economically collapsed and printed cash. Well, yeah,
Well,
that's what they will
that's
do. Yeah,
absolute. That's just absolute bullshit. You know, the Shona people, who were the minority in terms of population, and they were the oppressed victims of a slow but consistent genocide by the Matabele. Um, had a phrase in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, and they used to call it the power of the pen. And the power of the pen was essentially learn to write, learn what these white men are teaching you, and your life changes. And Rhodesia had many, many, many black graduates in every field: medical, technical, and all the others. So yeah, that's just a communist cop out.
No, it was very much a civilization force for everybody in the country. But of course, race communists aren't going to tell you about that.
No, they're not.
Rick Reed says that I think Zimbabwe is trying to bring farmers in again, but there is a sizable tax they want to charge them, although this may have been a few years ago. But I
Okay.
do remember that famous article where essentially it was like, please come back, white farmers. I mean, I think you remember that article.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I can talk to this. I mean, I was a white farmer, so I know what's going on. Look, they never really invited white farmers back. There's an olive branch with some with some strychnine or some arsenic on the end of it. There's no way you would leave a life and go back to Zimbabwe and then get a farm from the government that they own and then go and put all your own capital into it and then, develop it again after what happened. That's just not true. But what is happening, to answer the question in reality, is that the people that are of farming stock and are farmers in Zimbabwe are taking advantage of large corporations out of China and the West, where huge amounts of money are being thrown at specific crops such as tobacco, and some white guys are doing pretty well still farming tobacco on land that was stolen by Mugabe. So it's kind of like with us roadies, us Zimbabweans, it's a sore point. There's guys who are still ethically farming in Zimbabwe, where they may be given or negotiate a piece of land that was formerly owned by a white farmer who's now living in South Africa or Australia, and they will then contact that farmer and actually give them a portion of their earnings as compensation. But there's no such thing as a real olive branch being given out by the Zimbabwean government to white people. That's a myth.
Definitely. Mr. Moeller D. Wet says, "Hi, Roy. Enjoying the talk so much. I grew up in, I can't pronounce that word, born 85. My grandfather was Frick Mueller and was actively involved with Mr. Smith. It's so important to know our history. Thanks for sharing, sir."
Oh, Muller de Vet. That's a lekker name. Yeah, look, Frick Muller, your grandfather was Frick Muller. Yeah, look, I'm just really happy that you tuned in. There's just so little nowadays about the reality of who we are as a people. To give you an example, man, I don't know where you're, listening from or watching from, but I come from the Western Cape of South Africa now, in a place called the Klein Karoo. My daughter is a policewoman in the London Met. My mother lives in Orlando, Florida. My sister lives in Livingston, in Zambia. And we've been scattered to the four winds because of the destruction of our country. So hats off to you, Mullah Devet. God bless you, sir.
And thank you for joining our conversation today. I really appreciate it. American elitist,
Hey,
did any
I've enjoyed this, man.
Rhodesians... yeah, I greatly enjoyed this conversation, Mr.
Okay, go on.
Rhodesia at all might manage to weather the storm and still reside in Zimbabwe, or they all had to flee when things went violent. Well, I think
Okay,
Mr.
good
Roy just
question.
kind of, yeah. You go
Yeah,
ahead.
no, that's cool. I'll answer that. Look, um, in 1975, there were 450,000 white Rhodesians. Today, including expats and tourists, there's no more than 15 to 20,000 white people in that country. I don't think any more than that. Certainly not enough to fill up a football stadium by any means. I think actual white descendants of Rhodesian culture must be in the thousands, not even the tens of thousands. And the latest assessment I got a couple of years ago is about 8,000 actual Zimbabwean white people still exist.
All right, well, there you go to answer your question, Rick. Um, I think this will be our last question. I forgot if it was a willing exodus or if last few were forcibly pushed out to many of those countries to not mix up their final days. We all of them feel very similar because they're all governed by the same sorts types of people.
Yeah. Look, leaving is a choice. Leaving the country is a choice, but often it's the only choice because if you're a farmer, like my family, 6 generations farming, and then sorry, fuck you, get out. Well, what do you do? I was farming until I think 2010. It became unmanageable. I then went gold mining. I tried everything to make money, and eventually I just packed it in and came to South Africa. Look, there were other circumstances involved, political and otherwise, but yeah, it's a willing exodus, and I think what needs to be said here, just to round it off, is that we're talking about white people here in terms of the fact that yeah, we were Rhodesians and we suffered for sure under the hands of Mugabe. But let me tell you something. Um, at least 3 to 5 million black Zimbabweans are scattered across the world as we speak, many of them in South Africa, professional and otherwise.
Definitely, the global Zimbabwefication doesn't just affect former roadies; it affects, well, at least the blacks were like smarter to realize the situation isn't going very well for them and don't buy into the communist, global race communism propaganda of the Mugabe regime, and now his successors basically have taken over that country. But Mr. Roy, like I've greatly appreciated you joining this conversation. Is there anything you would like to share or let the audience know you're working on? Where can they find you if they're interested in contacting you or learning more about you?
Oh, that's kind of you to have me on here, man. I'm not too big on social media, no more than anybody else, but I'm Rory Duncan, and you can find me on X pretty much. I'm on Facebook a little bit, mostly to keep in touch with old pals from back in the day. And yeah, I've done a couple of YouTube things with a couple of really good people. K9 Reaper is one, and one of my favorite people in the world, old Ernest Van Sale, Conscious Caracal. So you're welcome to look that stuff up. But listen, dude, thank you so much for having me. God bless you, man. And let's do another one. Let's do a follow up. Let's think about something that we can talk about going forward. I'd really like that. Thank you so much.
Definitely, I'd love to have you back on. I really appreciate all the audience for joining me in this conversation. If you did enjoy this conversation, leave it a like and subscribe. That's always appreciated. And have a good West your afternoon. Thank you all.